Are you serious, gunnery sergeant? The words sliced through the scorching California desert air like a blade through silk. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood with his arms crossed, his jaw set in a line of absolute contempt. His gaze, sharp and dismissive, fixed on the figure standing quietly near the range check-in desk. An old man, 81 years old to be exact. Stooped shoulders, weathered skin like dried leather, hands that trembled ever so slightly as they held a worn canvas shooting jacket. You're telling me this gentleman wants to qualify on the M40A6? The disbelief in Thorne's voice was thick, toxic. It hung in the air, making the young Marines nearby shift their weight uncomfortably. They stood in a loose half circle, their crisp uniforms and high and tight haircuts marking them as the future of the Corps. They watched the confrontation unfold with a mixture of secondhand embarrassment and morbid curiosity. Some smirked, others looked away. But all of them felt the cruelty radiating from their commanding officer. Raymond Hunt said nothing. He didn't defend himself, didn't argue. He simply stood there, his pale blue eyes steady and distant, as if he were looking not at the colonel, but through him, through the present moment, through the noise and the heat and the mockery. His silence was not weakness. It was something else entirely, something the young Marines couldn't name, something that felt ancient, immovable. If you knew who this man really was, you'd drop to your knees and beg forgiveness. But Colonel Thorne didn't know, and he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. "Sir," Gunnery Sergeant Miller began, his voice tight with the respect the colonel clearly lacked. "Mr. Hunt is a certified civilian marksman. He has all the proper paperwork. He just requests 1 hour on Lane 4. Lane 4. The words hung in the air like a prayer, but Colonel Thorne heard only nonsense. "Paperwork?" Thorne scoffed, snatching the clipboard from Miller's hands. He scanned the documents with theatrical slowness, his lip curling in disgust. "This certification is older than half the men on this range. Look at him, Gunny. He can barely stand upright. You want me to hand him a $200,000 rifle system so he can what? Tell war stories and maybe hit the berm if we're lucky?" The colonel stepped closer, his polished boots crunching on the gravel. He was a full foot taller than Raymond, radiating self-importance in every inch of his pressed uniform. Raymond didn't flinch. He simply met the older man's gaze with those pale, unflinching eyes. "Sir," Raymond said quietly, his voice a low rumble, "I'm just here to fire a string. I won't be a bother." "A bother?" Thorne's voice rose, sharp and cutting. "This is the United States Marine Corps Advanced Sniper Range, not a county fair shooting gallery. We have active duty personnel who need this time. We have warfighters to train. We don't have time for nostalgic field trips from grandfathers playing dress-up." The circle of onlookers was growing now. Young lance corporals and privates, fresh from boot camp or infantry school, watched with wide eyes. They saw a confrontation between a formidable colonel and what appeared to be a fragile old man. Their loyalties were with the rank, but something about the scene felt wrong. Deeply wrong. Thorne tapped a dismissive finger on Raymond's faded canvas shooting jacket. The jacket was simple, old-fashioned, with leather patches at the elbows and a worn texture that spoke of decades of use. It looked completely out of place among the digital camouflage and tactical gear that surrounded it. "What is this supposed to be?" Thorne asked, smirking. "You pull this out of a museum?" Then he saw it, a small patch stitched onto the jacket's breast. It was dark green, almost black, with a faded silver thread design, frayed at the edges. A relic. Some forgotten unit, I suppose, Thorne sneered, trying to relive the glory days. Raymond's eyes dropped briefly to the patch, just for a moment, and in that moment the world seemed to shift. The harsh desert sunlight dissolved into thick, suffocating green. The smell of rain and rot filled his lungs. He was 19 again, lying in the mud of a Vietnamese jungle. The same patch, brand new then, sewn onto his boonie hat by a kid from Ohio named Danny. They called themselves the Spectres. Ghosts who were never seen, only felt. The memory flickered and died. Raymond blinked. The desert sun returned. He said nothing. "I need to see your identification," Thorne demanded, holding out his hand like a king expecting tribute. "And I want to see your hands. I need to be sure they're steady enough not to endanger my Marines." It was calculated humiliation. Public. Cruel. Raymond slowly pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket. He opened it and extended both hands. They were wrinkled, the skin thin over prominent knuckles, but there was not a single tremor, steady as granite. Thorne glanced at the license and scoffed. "Raymond Hunt. Well, Mr. Hunt, your little day trip is over. I am denying this request on the grounds of safety and operational tempo. Gunnery Sergeant, please escort Mr. Hunt off this base immediately. Gunny Miller stood frozen. He looked from the colonel's smug face to Raymond's impassive one. Something was wrong here. Terribly wrong. The paperwork wasn't just valid, it was sponsored by someone high. Very high. A name so far up the chain of command that Miller had assumed it was a typo when he first saw it. But he had his orders. Sir, if you'll follow me, Miller said quietly, his voice thick with something that felt like shame. Raymond nodded, but before he turned to leave, he spoke one last time. The request was for Lane 4 specifically, he said, his voice even. It's important. Thorne's face flushed red. The audacity, I don't care if you requested the moon, he snapped. Your request is denied. This range is for warriors, not for grandfathers playing soldier. Get him out of here before I have him cited for trespassing. The humiliation was complete. Gunny Miller walked Raymond Hunt to a shaded bench near the parking lot. He made sure the old man was seated comfortably, promised to bring water, then excused himself. But he didn't go to the cooler. He walked quickly behind the range control tower, pulled out his personal cell phone, and scrolled through his contacts with shaking fingers. There was one number he kept for absolute emergencies, a direct line to Master Sergeant Frank Davis at the base command building, a man who had seen everything, who knew everyone, who had been in the Corps longer than Miller had been alive. He pressed call. Davis, a gruff voice answered after 2 rings. Master Sergeant, it's Gunny Miller down at the Hathcock Range. Miller kept his voice low, glancing over his shoulder. Sorry to bother you, sir, but we have a situation. What is it, Gunny? Did one of your new shooters forget which end the bullet comes out of? No, sir, it's Colonel Thorne. He just ejected a civilian from the range. There was a sigh on the other end. Thorne is an ass, Miller. We all know it. Why are you calling me about it? File a report. Sir, it's who he ejected, Miller pressed, his heart pounding. He felt like he was walking a tightrope over a canyon. The civilian's name is Raymond Hunt. Silence. For a full 5 seconds, the only sound was static. Miller wondered if the call had dropped. Then Master Sergeant Davis's voice came back. But it was completely different. The gruffness was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp urgency. Say that name again, Gunnery Sergeant. Hunt, sir, Raymond Hunt. Spell it H-U-N-T. Another pause. This one filled with a tension Miller could feel through the phone. Gunny, Davis said, his voice now dangerously quiet. Keep that man there. Do not let him leave the base. Use whatever excuse you have to. I don't care if you have to tell him the general wants to polish his boots. Just keep him there. Do you understand me? Yes, Master Sergeant, Miller said, stunned. Good. Help is on the way. The line went dead. Miller stood there, staring at his phone, a cold realization washing over him. Colonel Thorne hadn't just made a mistake. He had kicked a hornet's nest, a very, very old one. Inside the base command building, Master Sergeant Frank Davis slammed the phone down. His face had gone pale. For a man who had spent 30 years in the Marine Corps, from the streets of Fallujah to the mountains of Afghanistan, it took a lot to rattle him. But the name Raymond Hunt was a lightning strike from a clear sky. It wasn't a name you heard casually. It was a name you read about in dusty, classified after-action reports. A name whispered in instructor lounges at Quantico. A name that belonged to legends, not living men. Davis didn't walk. He ran. He burst from his office, startling a young corporal, and sprinted down the polished hallway of the command building. His boots echoed like gunshots. He didn't bother knocking on the base commander's door. He threw it open. General James Peterson, a 2-star general with a chest full of ribbons and a face carved from stone, looked up from his paperwork with a flash of irritation. Master Sergeant, what is the meaning of this? Sir, my apologies, but this is an emergency, Davis said, still breathless. It's Colonel Thorne, sir, down at the Hathcock Range. The general's expression hardened. What has Thorne done now? He threw a civilian off the range. Denied him access. Peterson sighed, exasperated. Frank, I'm busy. Can't this be handled by the provost marshal? Davis leaned forward, lowering his voice. Sir, the civilian's name is Raymond Hunt. The general froze. The pen in his hand stopped moving. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes widening as the name registered. He stared at Davis, searching his face for any sign this was a joke. Raymond Hunt, are you certain? Gunny Miller just called me from the range. H-U-N-T, it's him, sir. General Peterson's entire demeanor changed. The annoyed administrator vanished, replaced by the warrior. He rose from his chair, his movements suddenly crisp and urgent. Frank, the general said, his voice a low command. Get my vehicle. Get the sergeant major. Now, tell them to skip the sirens. We go quiet. Within 2 minutes, a convoy of Black Command vehicles was tearing down the access road toward the Hathcock Range. Back at the range, Colonel Thorne was basking in his perceived victory. He paced before the assembled Marines, a swagger in his step. "Let that be a lesson for all of you," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent firing line. "This is an elite institution. There is no room for sentimentality. There is no room for relics. The standards are the standards for a reason." Raymond Hunt sat on the bench where Gunny Miller had left him, sipping from a bottle of water. He seemed perfectly content to wait, his gaze fixed on the distant hills beyond the range. Hills that, in another lifetime, had looked very different. Greener, wetter, more dangerous. Thorne, not satisfied with his victory, decided he needed one final, definitive act. He strode over to Raymond, his shadow falling over the old man like a threat. "I thought I told you to leave," Thorne said coldly. "The gunnery sergeant asked me to wait," Raymond replied calmly. "Well, I'm countermanding his request. I'm going to give you 60 seconds to get your ancient bones off my range before I have you cited for trespassing." He was so focused on his own power, so consumed by his arrogance, that he didn't hear the soft crunch of tires on gravel behind him. He didn't see the Black Command vehicles pulling to a stop. He didn't see the doors fly open, but everyone else did. The young Marines saw the general's 2-star flag on the lead vehicle. They saw General Peterson emerge, his face a thundercloud, followed by the base sergeant major, a man whose scowl could curdle milk. They moved with a speed and intensity that signaled a crisis of the highest order. The entire range fell silent. Every Marine, as if moved by a single nerve, snapped to the position of attention. The sudden, unified crack of heels coming together was the only sound. Colonel Thorne finally turned, confused by the sudden silence. His jaw went slack, his face drained of all color. General Peterson walked right past him, didn't spare him a glance, as if the colonel were nothing more than a piece of furniture. He marched directly to the bench where Raymond Hunt was slowly getting to his feet. The general stopped 1 foot in front of the old man, who now stood straight, the frailty gone, replaced by an undeniable dignity. Then the 2-star general did something that sent a shockwave through the assembled crowd. He snapped to the sharpest, most profound salute of his career, a salute of utter, unconditional respect. "Mr. Hunt," General Peterson's voice boomed, full of a deference no one had ever heard from him before. "It is an honor, sir. I apologize for the welcome you have received." Raymond simply nodded, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes, and returned a slow, respectful nod of his own. The crowd of young Marines stared, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. A 2-star general, saluting a civilian, Colonel Thorne looked like he had been turned to stone. The general turned to face the stunned audience. His eyes swept over the young Marines, the NCOs, and finally settled on Colonel Thorne with the force of a physical blow. "For those of you who don't know," the general began, his voice ringing with authority, "you have been standing in the presence of a legend. This is Raymond, the Ghost Hunt." A wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. The Ghost. It was a name from Marine Corps lore, a sniper who had become a myth in the jungles of Vietnam, a man credited with shots that were technically impossible, who held records that modern science said were unbreakable. "Mr. Hunt is not here to qualify," the general continued, his voice laced with ice as he looked at Thorne. "He is here, as he has been on this day for the past 50 years, to honor the memory of his spotter, Corporal Daniel Ames, who was killed in action on this date in 1971. He does so by firing a single 10-shot string on Lane 4, the lane they always trained on together. It is a tradition that was approved by the Commandant of the Marine Corps himself decades ago. A tradition, Colonel, that you would know about if you spent half as much time reading the history of this Corps as you do your own fitness reports." The public humiliation of Colonel Thorne was absolute. The young Marines now looked at Raymond with new eyes, with awe. They weren't looking at an old man anymore. They were looking at a ghost, a living monument to their own highest ideals. The general turned his full, undivided attention to the colonel. The rebuke was not loud, but it was devastating in its precision. "Colonel Thorne, your command of this range is hereby revoked. You will surrender it to Gunnery Sergeant Miller for the remainder of the day. You and I will have a conversation in my office at 1600 hours. I suggest you spend the intervening time reflecting on the Marine Corps values of honor, courage, and commitment, as you have displayed none of them today. You are dismissed." Thorne, his face ashen, could only manage a choked, "Yes, sir." He turned and walked away, his career in tatters, the eyes of every Marine on him like daggers. In the silence that followed, Raymond Hunt finally spoke. He looked at the young Marines, then at the general. His voice was not triumphant, but soft and full of quiet wisdom. "General, the boy just made a mistake," he said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the retreating colonel. "He sees the uniform, not the man. It's an easy mistake to make these days." He turned his gaze to the young Marines. "Remember this?" he said, his voice carrying unexpected weight. "The uniform changes. The weapons get better. The enemy has a different face. But respect? That's the bedrock. It's timeless. Every person you meet in or out of this corps is carrying a history you know nothing about. It's better to assume it's a heavy one." The fallout for Colonel Thorne was swift and silent. The Marine Corps preferred to handle such matters internally. A week later, his name was on a transfer list. His new assignment was a windowless office in the Pentagon basement, analyzing supply chain logistics for the commissary system. It was a career-ending move, a slow, quiet exile. In his place, General Peterson mandated a new training module for all personnel on base, focused on veteran relations and the institutional memory of the Corps. The first lesson was titled The Ghost of Hathcock Range. Several months later, Marcus Thorne, now in civilian clothes, was in a local garden center. He was looking at bags of fertilizer when he saw a familiar figure by the tomato plants. Raymond Hunt, inspecting a small seedling with gentle focus. Thorne's first instinct was to turn and walk away, but Raymond's words echoed in his head. "It's what you do next that defines you." He took a deep breath and walked over. "Mr. Hunt," Thorne said, his voice barely a whisper, "I just wanted to say I was wrong." Raymond looked at him for a long moment, then a small, sad smile touched his lips. He nodded. "We all are sometimes, son," he said. "The trick is to learn, to grow something better in the soil you're given." He offered Thorne his hand, calloused, strong. After a moment's hesitation, Thorne shook it. Later that evening, Raymond was on his knees in his backyard planting tomatoes in the rich soil. The old canvas shooting jacket hung on a hook by the back door. Inside, on his nightstand, sat the worn, frayed Spectre patch, a silent, humble testament to a promise kept, to a brother never forgotten. If Raymond Hunt's story of quiet valor and unshakable loyalty moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories of courage, respect, and the heroes who walk among us every day.